Mr. President, I called an amendment up that's now on the floor of the United States Senate, and it is a very, very simple one, maybe one of the most straightforward, short amendments offered in the course of this debate. The amendment is very simple. It simply refers this bill back to the committee with instructions to bring back a bill which is deficit neutral. And I believe that can be done. And I think it can be done in a very short period of time. And I think it's important, and I'm going to outline why. But before I get to that, I'd like to mention that Senators Tester, Whitehouse, Harris, Van Hollen, Kaine, Warner, Bennett, Udall, Heitkamp, Manchin, Coons, and Feinstein are all announced supporters of this amendment, and I wanted to offer my thanks and appreciation to them for their assistance. Again, the amendment's very simple. Recommit the bill, have the committee work it once more, and come back to the Senate floor with a bill that does not bust the deficit. This is one of the most important votes any of us will take in this body. I think it may be the most important. This is a bill that will affect America and Americans for a generation. If past history is any guide, this will be the major tax reform bill in the next 20 to 30 years. It will affect every business, every citizen, and our entire economy. The stakes, in other words, are incredibly high. And it's my assumption that when the stakes are high, the bar for the process would also be high. If you're doing something with such enormous ramifications, it's common sense that you would take a great deal of care to thoroughly understand the provisions of the bill, its implications, its impacts, its possible unintended consequences, and be as careful as would be possible in order to determine how this bill will affect our country and our economy. Instead, Mr. President, we have the worst possible process. In other words, we have the highest stakes and the lowest process. It's the worst process I think I've ever seen in a public body. The Bangor City Council would not amend the leash law using this process. We are talking about one of the most important bills any of us will ever vote on that has had 0 hearings before the United States Senate. It has had no input from the citizenry, no input from outside of the community of this body. In fact, the committee that has brought the bill to the floor. No outside expert analysis. There are bound to be mistakes in this bill. In fact, I have a new rule I'm proposing today. I'm calling it modestly King's Law. King's Law is the faster a bill goes through this body, the worse it will be. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about bringing something through the United States Senate, supposedly the world's most deliberative body, with little or no deliberation. And the impacts are going to be enormous. I just believe that we can slow down and do this right. In 1986, the last time there was a major tax reform in this country, it's very instructive to look back and watch and look and see how they did it. Number one, it was bipartisan from the beginning. It was bipartisan from the beginning, and the Senate Finance Committee had 33 hearings on the bill. 33 as compared with 0. Have we really fallen that far in this institution that we can't even have a series of hearings to understand what it is that we're doing? It took 10 months to consider that bill and to come to a conclusion and a vote on the Senate floor. 10 months. We're talking about a matter of days for the consideration of this bill. And the final point about the 1986 bill is that it passed the Senate with 90 votes. That could happen here. I was on a stage with 16 colleagues, members of the Democratic caucus, 2 days ago, all of whom are prepared, ready, and anxious and able to support tax reform, including cutting the corporate tax rate to make our businesses more competitive. But there's been no process to let them in, to allow them to talk. The point I'm trying to make here is that the vote that we take tonight or tomorrow morning or whenever it is does not have to be the end of this process. It can be the beginning of a real process, which is what it should be. Now, my real concern, or one of my concerns, there are a lot of problems with this bill, but the concern that I want to focus on today in the background of my amendment, which recommits and asks that the committee come back with a deficit-neutral bill, is the debt and the deficit itself. This is a chart that should strike fear into the hearts of every American. This is basically the history of our national debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. This isn't dollars, because that can be misleading. Dollars, of course, are worth less now than they were in 1930 or in 1850. So this is percent of gross domestic product. It starts back in 1790 when the early Americans were paying off the debt from the Revolutionary War. And if you notice, there's a pattern here that stops right here. The pattern is when we get into major catastrophes, including wars, that's when we have to borrow money. And that's what we did. And here's the Civil War. But it was paid down. 1910, then World War I, another huge expenditure. This is why you preserve your borrowing power for when you actually need it. And then World War II. Now, this line that goes down right here is the Greatest Generation. The Greatest Generation not only fought World War II, they paid for it. They paid down the debt. And it goes down into the 1970s. And then we have a bump up and then down. But look where we're headed. Look where we're headed. We're headed to a place where we aren't going to be able to sustain this debt. Everybody knows that. And yet the bill that we're voting on today expands the deficit by somewhere between $500 billion and $2.5 trillion, depending upon how it's all sorted out. Of course, there's a little bit of fake bookkeeping where the personal changes to the tax code expire in order to not bump up the cost within the budget window, but everybody knows, and people on the majority who are supporting this bill are winking and nodding, saying, of course, those will be extended. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say they're going to be extended and take credit for that and then turn around and say, oh, don't worry about the deficit. This is the Greatest Generation. This is the Me Too generation that's not paying for things. And it's shameful. It's shameful. And it is going to come back to haunt us. Here's why. We are now in a kind of Alice in Wonderland of interest rates, the lowest interest rates that we've had in my lifetime. Around 2% is what we're paying on our federal debt. The problem is the average for interest rates on our federal debt over the last 50 years is about 5.5%. Well, it's a real easy calculation when the debt is $20 trillion. 1% on the debt is $200 billion a year. If you go to 5.5%, just interest on the debt is $1.1 trillion. Now, if that number rings a bell to anyone in this room, that's because that's the size of the entire current federal discretionary budget, defense and non-defense. $1.1 trillion just in interest. Interest rates are already starting to creep up. This is not an abstract fear. This is a high likelihood. Now, I've been around public life and politics for a long time, and I've heard a lot about deficits, and people are concerned about deficits. Until today, the deficit doesn't seem to be a big deal anymore. I predict that after this bill passes, within a couple of years when the deficits start to mount up, the same people who are voting for this bill today are going to say, oh my goodness, we have these huge deficits. What are we going to do? I think we have to cut entitlements. We have to cut Social Security. We have to cut Medicare. And certainly we have to cut all those domestic programs. Well, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I don't think that's right. We had a hearing this morning in the Armed Services Committee with a group of people talking about our national defense strategy. And virtually everyone at that table, I think there were 5 or 6, agreed that the cost of rebuilding our defense capability over the next 10 years will be about $1 trillion. That's over and above the current defense budget. So we're talking about an additional $1 trillion. That happens to be the amount that this budget, that this tax bill will suck out of the revenues of this country and be unavailable for any purpose, including defense. Those who are concerned in this body about national security should be very concerned about this bill. I believe it will make it impossible to do the kind of restoration of the national security apparatus in this country that is necessary, because we're not going to have the money. What we're doing is simply borrowing money from our children to give ourselves tax cuts. That's really the essence of what's going on here. If we were cutting taxes on a revenue-neutral basis, that would make sense. I think you can make an argument. We're going to broaden the base and lower the rates. All of those kinds of things can be done. You can get the stimulative effect, but instead, all we're doing is shifting the tax to our kids. If you're already in a deficit situation and you cut taxes further, it makes a hole. You fill the hole with borrowed money. That borrowed money is going to have to be paid back by these young people that are sitting in this room today. Mr. President, if 5-year-olds knew what we were doing and could vote, none of us would have a job, because we are spending their money. It's as if you're lying on your deathbed, you call your children over to hear your last words, and your last words are, "Here's the credit card. We had a great vacation, your mother and I. You pay the bill." That's what we're doing, and it's wrong. It's unethical. We are passing the bill on to our children. Now, I know that the purpose here is to stimulate economic growth, and I'm all for it. And I believe, and said earlier on, I can see where a reduction of corporate tax rates and offshore rates is called for to make us competitive in the world economy. But the idea that these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves, it's never happened. It's never happened. It hasn't happened. Didn't happen to the Bush tax cuts, hasn't happened in Kansas. It just hasn't happened. So we're talking about a dramatic increase in the federal deficit on top of what's already coming. That's what's really bothersome about this. We can't talk about this bill in isolation without acknowledging we're already spending $500 billion a year more than we're taking in relatively good times. These are the times when we should be paying back this debt, not making it worse. No rational business would be taking on debt when they're doing well. When you're doing well, you pay down your debt, and then you have a reserve for when you need it. We have no reserve. We're using up our cushion. We're using up whatever cushion we might need for disasters, for some kind of, heaven forbid, conflict, or simply for a recession. This is an incredibly destructive bill, and it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. This is a place where I believe we can work together. This isn't a yes or no issue. I understand the health care debate was really a yes or no issue. Do you want to repeal the Affordable Care Act or not? That was yes or no. This, however, is about numbers. Should the corporate rate be 25, 22, 28, or 20? Or how do you deal with the AMT, or the estate tax, or the personal exemption? All of those dials can be changed in order to achieve a targeted growth, which is what we all want, and I realize growth is the best way to solve this problem, without at the same time exacerbating this really serious deficit problem that we're headed into. There are provisions of this bill that have nothing to do with economic growth. The estate tax, what does that have to do with it? Eliminating the AMT, what does that have to do with economic growth? There are provisions of this bill that don't meet the theory of the bill, and yet significantly aggravate its fiscal effect. So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, again, my amendment is really very straightforward. Recommit the bill, come back with a deficit-neutral bill, which I think can be done. It wouldn't take a month, but have some hearings that will get us some information about what the impacts of this bill will be, and we will have a much better bill. It could be a bipartisan bill, and we can meet the responsibilities that we have to the American people. Mr. President, I believe that we owe the people no less. As I said at the beginning, there will be no more important bill we can vote on in this body, in our careers, and we owe it to the American people to, number one, understand fully what we're voting on, and two, to do it in the most careful possible way, to be the most targeted and most effective and most responsible change that we can make in order to help our economy and also help all the people of this country. There are many other issues with the bill, but I chose today to focus in my remarks and also on my amendment on the effects on the deficit, because I think it's one of the most long-term threats. In fact, a former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said the national debt is the most serious threat to our national security in the long run, and to aggravate it unnecessarily, as this bill would do, I think is irresponsible. Mr. President, we can do better. I am sure of that if we'll slow down, listen to one another, and do what the American people expect of us.